All right. So where we left off last time in our notes, we were talking about how the king had he finally had a revolution on his hands. And we saw the masses of people start to invade the Bastille and destroy the Bastille. They completely destroyed the Bastille. We talked about the symbolic meaning of that, and that was the French people moving on from the king. They were wanting a new way of life. So today we're going to talk about how the king is going to try to escape from France. He's going to almost make it, but then he's going to end up going to his ultimate trial and execution. So we want to start off, though, talking about Marquis de Lafayette and the constitutional monarchy. So, we always know from Lafayette from the musical Hamilton, because he helped the American soldiers in the American Revolution. So he was a general in the French army and a member of the elite ruling class. He was an elite. He was a rich, but he was an advisor to the Americans during the American Revolution, and he became the president somewhat, and he helped to create a constitution that restricted those who had the right to vote, but it still allowed the king to delay any new laws for up to 2 years. So this government starts to take over, and they're trying to kind of cut down on the king's power. So he doesn't have absolute power anymore. He has a constitution now. So, but he's still the king. And this was supposed to be this celebrated moment of working with the king and the National Assembly. They're finally starting to reform. They're starting to work together. And this lasted for about a year. This rich and poor working together lasted for about a year. Because Lafayette started to expand his powers, and he wanted to essentially become a dictator. So he wanted to pretty much become his own ruler. And so that's this first little rivalry group that we're going to talk about. The second group that we're going to talk about, it was Robespierre, Maximilien Robespierre, George Danton, and the Jacobins. So the Jacobins, they were this group of politically active men who were considered the most radical of all these groups that we're talking about. So the Jacobins, they were really radical. They had these crazy ideas of equality and people having the right to vote. Crazy. But so they were the most radical group, and Robespierre actually became the leader of the Jacobins, and he would end up going on to lead an overthrow of the government, which we'll get to later on in this lecture. And so their goal was to ensure that every citizen had the right to vote, regardless of their wealth. So your wealth should not determine whether you got to vote or not. And they worked to educate the Sans Culottes by bringing them to political rallies and propaganda, and use propaganda, which led to the radicalization. So the Sans Culottes, or who we're going to talk about in a second, they were essentially this poor, the poor class, the lower class. But we're going to talk about them in just a second. But they were educated in politics and how things were going to change by the Jacobins. So essentially, the Jacobins were political parties before there were political parties. So they were their own somewhat political party. And overall, though, the Jacobins' goal was to not just have a revolution and be done, but they wanted to completely transform the French society into one of true equality. So once again, crazy concept of, true equality. Okay, so I heard, this is a fun word to say, the sans culottes. So the sans culottes, it literally means, in English, it means men without fancy pants. So the common everyday person from the lower class. So men without fancy pants. Mr. Fancy Pants. But they were the revolutionary movement of the masses of poor, of the lower class. So they were the majority of France. And pretty much, they were the people who led the charge of the revolution. So the actual people on the ground fighting in the streets and fighting the guards and all of that, they were the protesters, sans culottes. And their main goal was to fight for the ability to vote and to have guaranteed food for their families. So once again, crazy concept. They wanted to be able to vote, and they wanted to have food for their families. Okay, so the king is starting to see that, things are starting to go bad for him. Things aren't going really how he's thinking, and he's making up this third group. So we had the constitutional monarchy with Lafayette. We had the Jacobins with Robespierre. Now we have the king and those who are still loyal to the king. So the elites and the royalists is what they were called. And the king is starting to say, hey, there's all these other countries that we talked about in the last lecture that were wanting to maintain the monarchy. So these other European monarchies were wanting to maintain the status quo. So the king said, if I can escape to these other countries, they'll keep me safe and invade France and put me back into power. So the king decides to take his family and escape to Varenne, Austria, which is next door to France. And so this flight to the Varennes, it marked a turning point in the French Revolution, another turning point that we're talking about. So his attempt to escape showed that the king had tried to abandon his people. So he was caught less than 5 miles from the border. He almost escaped, but he was caught in this tiny little city by somebody who recognized him. A mailman essentially recognized him and his family, and they stopped him. And so what was even worse, besides the fact that he was caught, Louis XVI thought that he was going to escape. So he had left behind pretty much a going away letter. And in that letter, he completely bashed the revolution. And he claimed that all of his efforts to support the revolution that he made it seem like he was supporting the revolution. Really, he claimed that it was all done because he was forced to, and he hated it. So essentially, he had lied, and he had broken the faith with his people, and this would ultimately seal his fate in the future. So this attempt to escape would mark a shift in support for the king, too. So never before, because he was supposed to be sent from God. So never before had people mocked him or made fun of him, but now newspapers are openly mocking him, making fun of him, and politicians are starting to argue that they need to go a step further and form a republic without the king. So this completely backfired on the king, and it just made things even worse for him. So we kind of already alluded to, these rival groups are starting to grow. They're like different groups that are all fighting for power. So we have the king and queen who were imprisoned, but they were still plotting with the other monarchs to overthrow Europe, or to overthrow the French government and take back control. So that's our first group, was the king and the royalists. Then we had Lafayette and the moderates, who were, they were falling apart over the different rivalries among themselves, and they had the fear of the lower class rising up. So Lafayette was technically like the president, you could call him, at the time, but their power was starting to fall apart as well. And so then the third group was this Jacobins, and they were led by Robespierre and George Danton, like we mentioned, and they were moving to replace Lafayette and take control of the government. And so each of the rival groups believed differently over whether to go to war with the other monarchs of Europe. Each of them had their own ideas. And, the king wanted to go to war because he believed the French would lose and he would be able to be put back in power. So he was like, yeah, let's go to war so that I can be put back as king. Lafayette, he wanted to go to war because he believed it would allow him to take complete control of the company or the country, and he would become a dictator. And then Robespierre was the only group, him and the Jacobins were the only group that was against war because he feared that it would cause everyone to lose focus on the revolution. So he thought that the war would distract the country away from their ultimate goal. But overall, all the rivals decided to work together to end up going to war. And so when we get to the Revolutionary War, we see that it was a complete disaster because the army was being destroyed by the invading other European countries, and the generals kept leaving to join the enemy. So when it looked like they were about to lose a battle, the French generals would just leave and join the other armies, which is what Lafayette ended up doing. So these things changed when the masses of the lower class started to join the war out of national pride. So these Sans Culottes started to join in the fight against the other countries. And so thousands of citizens ended up volunteering to fight. And so during all this, we get to the storming of the Tuileries, which is like the French palace, the king's palace almost, similar to the Palace of Versailles. So during this war, the war is still going on, and radicals like Robespierre, they were worried about losing the war. So they made the decision that they needed to expand the revolution. They needed to take the revolution a step further. And so radicals like Robespierre, they led a group of thousands of peasants and soldiers who ended up marching on the Tuileries Palace, and they placed the king under arrest. So this has never happened before. The king was essentially became a citizen and not a king. They placed him under arrest. And so the radicals and the Sans Culottes took control of the government, and they started a new government. So the ending of the monarchy and the beginning of, it should say the republic, excuse me. So it's the ending of the monarchy and the beginning of the republic. So like I said, they just finished taking over the government. They did away with the constitutional monarchy, and they voted to suspend the king. So the king is no longer the king. He's like being suspended. They recognized the new government where all new elections would allow all men to vote and not just certain ones. So all men had the right to vote, regardless of whether you own property or not. So the richest of the rich men and the poorest of the poor men, they were able to vote. Now, obviously, we see that women were still not allowed to vote, which was a issue that would not be solved for another 150 years. But this new government decided that to continue the revolution, they must first win the war. So they realized that they had to win the war in order to successfully conclude or continue the revolution. And so by September, the army had stopped the invading forces, and the forces and forced them to retreat out of France. So we see that the French finally were able to turn around the war once they focused in on the war, and they were able to defeat all these other countries that had joined together to fight them. And so on September 20th, 1792, they were able to, the new convention voted to end the monarchy completely, and they declared France a republic. So no longer is there a king at all. And so now what are they going to do with Louis XVI? So what are they going to do with Louis XVI? He's not a king anymore. So we get to the trial, judgment, and execution of the king. So not all members of the National Convention were for putting him to death. Some were worried that it would cause further war and that no king had ever been put on trial in France's history, so they weren't really sure what to do. And so the radicals made up of the lower class, led by Robespierre, they were all for killing Louis XVI. They were like, we need to go move past Louis XVI. We need to start a new era of French society. And if we keep him around, there's always going to be that threat of him trying to take back power. So he said, France has no other choice but to punish by death. And so Robespierre kind of caught everybody off guard, and it even caused splits among his own supporters. And so moderates favored keeping Louis XVI as a hostage and to ensure the future of France. But overall, it was decided that he would stand trial for his crimes against France, trying to escape, by bribery and many other crimes against people. And so by a vote of 693 to 21, he was found guilty, but only narrowly was it decided that he would face execution. So overwhelmingly, everybody believed he was guilty, but people were split on whether to kill him or not. But eventually, both Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were both executed by the guillotine on January 20th, or 21st, 1793. And so his last words were very interesting because even up to his death, he said, "I die innocent. I pardon my enemies, and I hope that my blood will be useful to the French, that it will appease God's anger." So he believed that he was becoming a martyr in a sense. And so after he was decapitated and his head was cut off, the crowd roared with chants of "Long live the Republic." So the people were ecstatic and happy to see him die, essentially. So how exactly did we get here? That's an interesting question because in a matter of like a couple of years, they went from just asking the king to make changes to killing him. And he was supposed to be sent from God, right? So this is major. So how did it become possible for the French to try and then to execute their king within only a few years? So in 1789, they couldn't imagine a world without a king. And in 1793, at the very beginning of 1793, they cut his head off. So that's huge. So the National Assembly had advocated a constitutional monarchy, which they instituted in 1791. But less than a year later, they're doing away with the monarchy altogether to create a republic. And so all of that to say, revolutions, they're not some quick decision. They're more of this sudden change in the balance of power that resulted from slow-moving developments that most people don't even recognize. So they happen, it seems like they happen all of a sudden, but really they had been happening behind the scenes for a long time. So things like this don't just happen overnight. And so historians, they generally agree that Louis XVI, he was open-minded and truly wanted what was best for his people, but over time, he just grew tired of having his decisions, having people questioning his decisions. So he was so used to having ultimate power for so long that when people started trying to put checks on his power, he didn't like it. So poor thing. And so his decision to run away, that's what sealed his fate. And the people saw his attempt to escape as the ultimate betrayal. So he essentially, by him trying to escape France, it showed the people that he was done with them and that he didn't care for them. So any kind of love they had for him ended with that. So we see this reign of terror. This is where we're going to pick up in our next lecture, because we're moving past the king and we're into this reign of terror with Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety and these guillotinings. So the revolution is going to expand and it's going to go a little bit too far. But I'm going to leave it at that for now, and we will pick up with this next time we meet.